on interactive experience on the latest public affairs content and resources. Watch for us in your community. Up next on C-SPAN 3, a conversation on the midterm elections from the Council on American-Islamic Relations. The group hosted a policy conference in Washington earlier this month. This is just over an hour.
A lot of us, I think, in our community, even though we've been organizing for many, many years, during this administration, I think we can all agree that the way we've been organizing in terms of, organizing community events and rallies and protests, it's been significantly different than pre-2017, pre-Trump. So, this panel is really going to delve in and talk to some of the key organizers and activists within our community to talk about, what they see in terms of the significance of community organizing, in terms of the significance of having mass mobilizations and protests, why we do it, whether they think it's impactful, how we should be organizing differently, if we should be doing anything differently moving forward, and how we can get folks, from our community to be more engaged in this process. So joining me today is Namira Islam. She's a Bangladeshi American lawyer and graphic designer. She's based in Michigan. She's the co-founder and executive director of Muslim ARC, which is an organization that trains and educates on racial justice. And to Namira's left, we have Azza. She's an award-winning disabled Afro-Arab organizer based in Washington, D.C., whose advocacy centers on radical inclusion and access, disability justice, and collective liberation. And joining us via Skype is Imam Omar Suleiman. He's an American Muslim scholar, civil rights activist, and speaker. He's the founder and president of the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, professor of Islamic Studies at Southern Methodist University. So, we wanted to delve in, just head on into the panel to make sure that we have enough time at the end for Q&A from you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'll ask 3 questions of our co-panelists. And the first question I wanted to ask you guys is if you could speak a little bit about the ways you've been organizing in your community, specifically, again, during this administration where our community has constantly been under attack, and ways that you think or believe that it's been different than traditional organizing efforts that you've been doing.
Okay, I can get started. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for being here. So Muslim ARC, we kind of have followed a different, very modern day method in terms of actually being founded on Twitter. So when we started out with the hashtag being black and Muslim, we had been planning for a few weeks for it. It went viral, trending globally in 7.5 hours. And this was back in February 2014 under the Obama administration. So with that hashtag, we were really picking up the nuances of who is often left out of the conversation about American Muslims. What are some experiences that are not spoken about in that kind of forum? And so with that hashtag, we spent the year of 2014, we really went in and focused, instead of generalizing all Muslims and trying to find one single story that defines all of us, we went in and really talked about Afro-Arabs, we talked about Latinx Muslims, we talked about Native American Muslims, we talked about white Muslims, whether second-generation converts or Irish or Bosnian, and we really started focusing on celebrating the nuances and the complexities. And under this administration, we know that the way white supremacist narratives work about the world is to try and simplify things as much as possible. They try to put us into silos. You are either black or Muslim. You are either organizing in the Muslim space or the AAPI space. You can't be this multi-layered, multifaceted, intersectional person who is sitting in multiple spaces because you were kept too busy kind of fighting these different fights. And so under this administration, we've really been working to reclaim the complexity and the nuances of all of our stories, to tell the multiple stories, whether it is around class lines, whether it is amplifying the stories of Native American Muslims at Standing Rock, really thinking about what are the places where people are flattening stories. The immigration narrative, kind of pointing out the different communities that are impacted, whether it's African Muslim immigrants or immigrants from other backgrounds, and really fighting to have coalitions that are then representative and that bring in all these different backgrounds, because ultimately the core root of everything that we are fighting together is white supremacy, and it's racism and it's anti-blackness, and a lot of these things are informing how Islamophobia operates, how other kinds of these isms and these oppressions that we are seeing in the world, how they operate. So why not build these coalitions that are very diverse in genuine ways, but are also inclusive, where everybody in that space is able to participate and have a say in how things are operating in that space, because that coalition is going to be the new face of the country, whether in 20 years, in 30 years. But unless we make intentional efforts, we are going to be kept apart in these different silos. And we have to go out of our way to really build these spaces very intentionally and actually use these coalitions to deal with the fights that we're facing. So in a nutshell, I would say that effort has really intensified with this new administration to say, okay, what is a coalition that has both Muslims and non-Muslims who are African, African American, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, and not just South Asian, but East Asian, and European, white, and all of these different backgrounds, Middle Eastern, but not just Arab, right? Whether you're Kurdish, whether you're Amazigan, really thinking about these coalitions and to really intensify efforts to get to know one another in these spaces in a very full way, in a very rich way, and then to build together from there.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Before I launch into my answer, I want to start by uplifting and acknowledging the Powhatan Native Nations upon whose unceded lands we're currently gathered. So to echo what Namira said, I think that one of the things that's really changed and intensified in this current moment has been the intentionality with which we recognized that an effective movement towards liberation is one that involves a lot of cross-movement building, right? It needs to bring in coalitions that are diverse, not just along racial and class lines, but really along all of the different axes in which people can experience marginalization. And as was mentioned, I primarily focus on the disability justice framework and really amplifying that in the course of the organizing and research work that I do. And the disability justice framework, to be clear, is one that advocates for a roadmap to collective liberation by being led and centering those who tend to be pushed to the furthest margins of our movement. The disability community is the largest global minority, but is rendered invisible in almost all of our spaces. That is a problem. 1 in 4 Americans identify as disabled. Muslim communities include disabled people. And even when we do have organizations that purport to represent disability interests and the disability justice framework, they are led by people who are not themselves disabled. And so with that, I want to share with you the refrain that we have organized around as a disability community for years. Nothing about us without us. The people who are the most qualified experts to talk about how systems of oppression affect us are the ones who are impacted by it directly. We are the experts in our experiences of that oppression, and therefore we are best equipped to shape a movement that will not leave anybody behind. So whenever we build a space, we have to be very cognizant of who isn't there and why aren't they there. Have we made space for people who are houseless to be there with us and to lead? Have we built space for people who were formerly incarcerated to be there with us and share space? Fully 1 in 3 Americans will have some sort of contact with the carceral state, predominantly people of color. Are they sharing this movement too? Are they leading this movement too? Those are the questions that we have to be asking ourselves as we build these spaces and as we build these movements. Because collective liberation means that everybody has a part, and that those who are most impacted are the ones who are leading us. So those are kinds of, I think, the frameworks that we've had and many communities have used and organized around historically, but that has really come to the forefront, I think, as this administration has really intensified and ramped up its attacks on marginalized communities of all kinds.
Imam Omar, can you hear us?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I think that one of the things that we have to recognize, and a lot of times I will be in a situation where I'm asked about what our strategy is with the Muslim community, right? And one of the things that I used to cringe at when I would be at a fundraiser for a relief effort, for example, in the community, would be that we have to do more relief work because it's better da'wah. So instead of talking about Islam, we have to go out there and do relief work because people see us on the field in action, they're going to have a better impression of Islam. As opposed to, this is a scriptural imperative to be out there and to help people in their time of need, regardless of what their faith is, regardless of what their background is. The anti-poverty, which is the most pure form of social justice, is actually deeply rooted in our tradition and something that we can draw from. So I think that when that carries over into forms of activism, when we talk about Muslim issues and we talk about political strategy versus what scriptural imperative is, what that means is that we start seeing issues like racial injustice or immigration reform or poverty or healthcare as being outside of the scope of the Muslim community and only things that we should engage in some transactional form, because that's the way that we can fit ourselves into this coalition that is at the moment responding to such an oppressive administration. When we talk about the structures of white supremacy and the structures of racial injustice and the structures that pit people against each other and that thrive on constantly having a scapegoat, well, we have to recognize that when we ally with other communities that are fighting against the exact same structure, that we're not fighting the current battle, but we're also trying to pave the way for a future country, a future climate that doesn't have the tools at hand to be able to marginalize and be able to constantly scapegoat and use the same playbook that's been used against other communities and used against the Muslim community as well. I also think that a lot of the divisions that we're seeing in wider society are also divisions that are found within the Muslim community, and we have to be honest about that. I'll give you just a very Dallas-centric example that, there's this constant discussion about the Muslim community in Dallas, and everyone is moving to Dallas because Dallas is becoming a hub of Islamic learning and Muslim communities. But almost all of those discussions are speaking about North Dallas. Dallas is 274 out of 274 in terms of racial segregation. It's the most segregated city in America. You have intense racialized poverty. And so when the Muslim community is talking about moving down to the Muslim community, they're talking about a North Dallas experience. So that division exists, which naturally gives a blind spot to almost all of the Muslims that are residing within the North Dallas area. So I think that that's even more, that's even more amplified in different discussions that are taking place right now. A lot of times I see Muslims only become sympathetic to immigration reform, for example, when they find that there are dreamers in our midst. So a lot of Muslims as well that have been living a very comfortable reality do not understand that the dreamers issue is not just a Latino issue. In New Orleans, in my community, when I was there, police brutality became an issue for the Muslim community when a sister from the Muslim community, who was an African-American doctor, married to a Pakistani-American doctor, was murdered by the police in New Orleans. And then suddenly the entire community woke up to realizing that, look, this is not just a reality that's suddenly dawned upon us as a Muslim community. It's just that this has been ignored by certain segments of the Muslim community. And we have to recognize that layers of privilege exist within the Muslim community that allow for certain Muslims to ignore certain elements of that structure that not just marginalizes other groups in America, but has marginalized a significant population of the Muslim community.
Great. Thank you so much, Imam Omar. So my co-panelists did a really great job in articulating some of, I guess like key ways that we could say we've been organizing during this administration, ways that it could be improved upon. Imam Omar, for instance, I think many of you know, he was fairly involved and active in in speaking out against this administration's heinous and unconscionable family separation policy. We have folks from our community that were incredibly active and outspoken in trying to block Gina Haspel's nomination, and she was a key figure in the U.S. torture program, and she was nominated for CIA director, right? We have folks that were active in the fight to try to block Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We have folks that were organizing in trying to safeguard ACA. So I guess my question for our panel is, if you have one recommendation in terms of, activists within our community, things that you'd like to see them doing differently, and ways that you think that our community could be more impactful in terms of either changing policy or affecting public opinion. I think all of you, I think, spoke about the need to make sure that we're fighting for an inclusive message, making sure that we're always fighting for marginalized communities, making sure that we're lifting up the voices of those impacted by these policies. So if you had one recommendation for activists within our community that you'd like to see them doing differently, what would that be?
So I think one thing that I want to be very, very clear about is that while we often focus on many of the things that this administration has succeeded in pushing forward and how that has really intensified the marginalization of different groups, we've also scored some wins, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, right? And to take time and space to recognize that our collective organizing efforts do work and they are meaningful, and that we need to persist in doing them. And with that being said, one thing that I really want to emphasize and that I want people to take away is when you're crafting your messaging, when you are figuring out how to build your movements, it needs to be done with a recognition that bargaining with white supremacy is not a win. Bargaining with white supremacy gets you individually a seat at the table, but it keeps that table in place. We are not going to do that and win a future of collective liberation. Those two things cannot coincide. So we must be that it requires an anti-capitalist politic. Just as we cannot get a seat at the table and call that a victory, dismantling white supremacy without dismantling the exploitative capitalist structures that depend upon white supremacy and that white supremacy itself depends upon, if we don't do that, we similarly cannot secure that future of collective liberation. And the final parting thought that I want to leave on this point is that you don't need to yourself have experienced a particular kind of marginalization to be committed to fighting it. It may not be the case that you can actually fully understand what it's like to be undocumented because you yourself are not. And that might not be an issue that directly impacts you or the people closest to you. But the thing is, when we talk about intersectionality as a theory of power, then it means at its root, we understand that even if the oppression that I experience doesn't look like the oppression that you experience, that the systems and structures that cause that oppression are connected and dependent upon one another. So I cannot afford to only fight the ways in which I'm marginalized. I must fight the systems, the codependent systems that are marginalizing anybody at all.
So I know you said one thing, but I'm going to make it a three-part one thing. So what I would say is, especially starting with intentionality, as Muslims, it's so important that, one, we are actually bringing our faith back into these spaces, and it's not something that we're leaving at the door because, oh, people are scared of Islam and Muslims, right? So the intentionality has to be there as to why we are doing this. This work is not easy, right? And it's very easy to then sit back and just kind of be like, well, let's just try and take shortcuts. Let's just try and put diverse faces on a poster, but then not really have inclusion in the space. Let's try and just kind of like really briefly know something and just kind of allude to it rather than really properly bring it in. And so intentionality about creating communities of care, intentionality about having that end goal in mind, that we are sending forward deeds for the hereafter, that this fight, we are planting seeds for something that will be happening that we may not even see in our lifetimes. We're doing this because we are being very deliberately Muslim. We are celebrating diversity, as Allah says, that our languages and our colors are signs of God, right? That we were created into nations and tribes so that we may know one another, and that we should be standing up for justice, whether it's against ourselves or our families. That means that we are putting this effort in for a lifetime, that we are really working to be deliberate and intentional and not trampling over people in a rush to get to like a more liberated world. Because sometimes those revolutionary acts are the things that we are doing on a day-to-day basis. Are we taking care of our neighbors? Do we even know our neighbors? Can we create a locality that is actually more equitable and just and fair that is around us? Because if we can't even do that, what are we trying to do at a national level? And different people need to be taking the different pieces of this work and lifting that up and really working in the ways that they're able to do this work. The second thing of this three-part answer is to really be intentional about how we use language. So this often reflects the education. I often say that learning about racism is not learned by osmosis. Just because you hear of it a lot in the news or wherever doesn't mean you automatically understand. So when we use certain language, it often can reflect some gaps that we have in knowledge. One thing that I often see, especially within Muslim spaces, is kind of this defaulting of certain identities, and then other identities are the ones that get the hyphens, right? And we all are familiar with this, living in the United States as American-Muslims or Muslim Americans, right? But even within Muslim spaces, you see kind of certain people can just say that they're Muslim, and then other people always preface it to say that they are this background of a Muslim, right? Because we are defaulting and we're creating cultural norms in a lot of the spaces that we're in. So I don't think the solution is just to pretend that we're all the same. The solution instead is to really, for every single person, even if you are kind of the majority in the space, to really acknowledge that and make the assumptions explicit, right? To be very intentional about what you are assuming and what you are defaulting in the space that you're in. The last piece of this is that long-term education piece. Because this work is long-term, we should not be falling into this trap of, hey, I'm too busy to educate myself, to educate other community members. I'm too busy fighting white supremacy. This is a centuries-old struggle, right? And ultimately, this fight about tribalism, arrogance, this goes back to satanic behavior, right? Iblis was the first one to say, I will not bow down in front of Adam alayhi salam because you created me of fire and you created him of clay. Something that none of us have control over, right? Like, what is our ethnic background? What nationality are we? We don't have control over that. But then to take that and be arrogant toward other people and say that, no, I'm better than you, that behavior is predates us. It will follow us. It's a societal condition that we all need to consistently be working on within ourselves to ward off this kind of arrogance, and to be educating others and to be working in communities together to really push back. Because this behavior is not something that we can just get a card that says, you know what, I am an anti-racist activist, right? And then you just have this lifelong membership. Every day you are working on this. Every day you are thinking about how to be more inclusive of those who are disabled, of those who are at the margins of our communities. Because as Muslims, it doesn't matter necessarily what is popular or trendy, right? We are supposed to be stable and the type of people that are here for communities of care all around us.
Imam Omar.
So since it was a three-part answer and very profound, I'm going to go ahead and also give a three-part answer, and based it on the intentionality element as well. This idea of intentionality, I think you really hit the nail on the head, because I think that a lot of times as Muslims, we're sort of viewing ourselves right now on this big coming out party to respond to the bigotry that is now so unveiled, not just against our community, but against many communities in the United States. And so sometimes there is just this idea of just diving out there in the public space and pushing back on Islamophobia, and it's not very well thought out. And so I actually want to just build on that idea of intentionality. And I'm going to give an acronym, TDS. Okay? And I hope that people are able to take this and actually think through the next time they're called to engage in a particular form of activism and how sustainable that engagement actually is. So the first one is it true to my faith? Rooting my activism in principles that are really based in my faith. And again, that's the difference between a transactional form of activism and one that will display itself not just in its sincerity, but in its persistence when other people turn their backs on an issue. And when we talk about worship, and again, I'm going to speak from a theological perspective, when we talk about worship in the religious sense, what distinguishes sincere worship from insincere spurts of worship is the consistency, right? So if you truly believe in what you are doing and you find the paradigms within your faith and those values deeply embedded within your faith, and that's what's causing you to act, then when other people move on to the next issue or the next community, you will stay the course. The first thing is it true to my faith? The second thing is best use of my time. So this is the B, best use of my time. I just made up this acronym literally as you were speaking, by the way. So if it's not very well thought out, then forgive me. But is it the best use of my intentionality in terms of structuring my particular engagement in that issue? A lot of activism, most activism, is quite performative. It's jump in the next protest and that issue becomes hot. Then we jump in the protest, we get the photo ops, we scream for a few days, and then we allow the media to dictate our energy and throw us into complete incoherence in regards to our activism. So we jump into the next issue and the next issue and the next issue without ever specializing or without ever deeply engaging in issues. So anti-racism is a great example of not doing that, right? Staying the course. So if anti-racism is not a discussion right now, that's still your work. That's still exactly what you're focusing on. I think that with a lot of Muslims, the idea of becoming an activist, you just wear this hat, this activist hat, engage all causes, but in very fluffy ways. And I think that would solve a lot of problems for our community in regards to some more problematic elements of activism, or those that make people uncomfortable, if we took issues that are near and dear to us and specialize in that issue. And so I think what I'm saying is that you want to find the difference between specializing in something and being present for another. So I might specialize in anti-police brutality work. One of my favorite anti-police brutality groups is Mothers Against Police Brutality. That's all they do. And you can hear the substance, what they propose every time there's a new police brutality discussion, that they have a list of demands. They're well thought out. They've really stayed the course and continue to work on that issue while still being present with other issues that are related to police brutality, since police brutality arises out of a larger racist structure. So criminal justice reform, the prison population, the industrial prison complex, all of those things are related, but they stay focused on police brutality work. So if you choose 2 or 3 issues max that you specialize in, and you give that your all, but your presence for other issues that are important to you. So I might just attend the demonstration for another issue, or a few meetings, or show my solidarity in other ways without necessarily fully jumping into that issue, because I need to do justice by the issues that I've chosen to specialize in. So if it's poverty, healthcare, racial structures, immigration reform. Pick an issue and specialize, or pick a couple of issues and specialize. Don't get lost into performance in the activist space. And that's where you're going to be more effective. And that directly ties to number one, which was, is it true to my faith? And the idea of sincerity being directly tied to consistency in the Islamic tradition. And the third thing, which is the S, is sustainability. The sustainability of my activism is very important. Protest is a spark or it is a symbol, but it is never the end solution, right? So it's a spark or it's a symbol, but it's never the solution. So the sustainability of my work, of my activism, is extremely important. So just like when you try to achieve anything else in life and you put forth a plan, a 1-year plan, a 2-year plan, a 5-year plan, I think it's important to constantly have those discussions, even if they are just with oneself, and think about how sustainable this particular form of activism is. And what my vision is in regards to that particular issue 5 years from now, when hopefully Donald Trump is nowhere around, and the structures that allowed for the structures and the societal trends, curves that allowed for Donald Trump to rise to presidency are still there. How do I keep working in regards to that effort and still trying to achieve my ultimate vision in regards to that particular issue?
Great, thank you so much, Imam Omar. So we have about 30 minutes for Q&A, and I did want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion. So I wanted to turn it over now to our audience. If you have any questions for the panelists.
Yeah, so I have a question for any of the panelists. So, he had mentioned specifically Dallas. So one thing that I'm from the South as well. So I was wondering, is there any difference that you guys have noted in how maybe this stuff takes place depending on which region of the United States we are in? I grew up in Canada, very liberal. So the way that you guys speak is often from this area, and he's in Dallas. So that's a different kind of ground reality that he's in. So if someone can maybe speak to that.
Imam Omar, I don't know if you wanted to, based on your travels as well, if you've noticed differences.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it ties to the deeper conversation about rooting our activism in values, because circumstances might very much so differ in different parts of the country. I mean, if we historically in this country, in the civil rights movement, there was a northern reality and there was a southern reality. There was the Dr. King reality, there was the Malcolm reality. And that reality is going to look different, not just in regards to a region, but even within a community that lives in the same region, right? And so I think that's why we take the values that are important to us, and then we continue to go back to those values and draw from those values to address the very particular circumstances. So exploitation is wrong. What does exploitation look like in Dallas versus Virginia, right? All of the immigration debate, the immigration discussion. I'm in, and I can't tell you what it does to me. I literally, just driving back to my house, I have to drive by this horrific immigration detention center, which is a $48 million detention center, which is being stacked constantly. I see that off the 35 on the highway every time I go to downtown Dallas and come back to my home. So I also should think regionally, like if there is something that's right in my backyard, then I think I have a greater responsibility to it. So perhaps when I'm thinking about what I'm going to choose to specialize in, then what I will factor into that intentionality in my activism is what's really right in my faith and can't be ignored. And again, that's spiritual, that's spiritual. The whole discussion of zakat in the Islamic tradition, that those that are in your backyard are most deserving of your zakat. That doesn't mean that you ignore that which isn't in your backyard. that means that maybe that's where my best use of time is engaging those issues that are amplified in my region and that remain connected to the other issues that are in other regions in the country and in the world. So I can continue to be present for those issues, but at the same time, I really want to hone in on these things because they're right in my backyard.
Yeah, if I can add briefly to what Imam Omar Suleiman was speaking to. So I'm from Northern Virginia. I was born, raised, and currently live in Alexandria, Virginia. And I think it provides a really good example of what you were getting at with your question, which is often a lot of the organizations that are based in this area tend to have a national focus and a national scope. They are advocating on national policies because it is the seat of the federal government, so it makes sense to be in DC. And when I really began my work, even though I was living in Northern Virginia, much of my work was centered in Washington, DC. And the danger of that was there wasn't a really intentional effort to build good grassroots organizations that were organizing around different issues in the Northern Virginia area. And when I began to get more involved with those organizations that did exist and that were extremely effective, what we realized was many of us, so for those of you who are from this area, Northern Virginia is a pretty liberal, progressive region, right? And so we were like, we always vote blue. We didn't really pay attention to the types of policies that were being implemented right under our noses. As it turns out, of only a handful of ICE detention facilities that contract with the federal government to hold minors, 3 of them were in Virginia, right? And we were electing people who were Democrats who were doing this. They were partnering and collaborating with groups that were doing violence to our communities. And a big part of why that pressure wasn't being applied until fairly recently was because we weren't organizing effectively at the local level. And that's really, I think, what's meant when we talk about how all politics are local, right? And our organizing should be too. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. What is needed and what needs to be amplified and what needs to be done and the ways in which we do it will look very different in Selma, Alabama than it does in Alexandria, Virginia, than it does in Dallas, Texas. And that's not only just okay, that's good, that's as it should be. So I think it's really important to be cognizant of the unique ways in which our individual communities are impacted, and then identify the people who are most marginalized by it and really amplify their needs and figure out creative ways to address them and advocate for policies that will address their concerns effectively.
And what I would say is that with Muslim ARC since 2014, we've been doing workshops and trainings all over the country, right? So we've been in about 40 different cities, reached about 12,000 people on the ground. So alhamdulillah, we've been, I personally have been able to visit a number of these cities to really talk to local activists, educators, students, and really talk to them about the culture that they're within. So I feel like there are some regional differences that I have noticed. I still personally, as somebody who's from the Midwest, I love the Midwest culture around organizing. I feel like there's a different level. I don't know whether it's because of labor union backgrounds or what is it, but there's a cultural norm around kind of this idea of solidarity and unity and strength in numbers. I feel like I have picked that up. That said, almost in every city, whether it's Seattle or like Twin Falls, Nashville, California, so Los Angeles area, I've noticed that similar themes will come up, which makes sense, right? Because you have these federal structures that are operating gentrification, whether it's a neighborhood in Chicago or a neighborhood in Baltimore, right? Like, I've been able to see these, go on these tours almost. People will kind of take me around to see the neighborhood where Freddie Gray was killed versus the downtown harbor area, right? In California and in Los Angeles and Detroit, thinking about gentrification, that always comes up. Access to democracy and education on local levels, the disparities that exist, poverty at local levels. Some of these issues are really common that I'm noticing certain themes that definitely come up. Access to water. I know in Michigan, we've got the Flint water crisis. People in Flint still do not have clean water. In Detroit, we have water shutoffs for residents. That issue, for example, has people like to exceptionalize it and be like, well, it's really tied to this one area, but the more we kind of look at it, the more environmental issues are all across the country with issues of access to something as fundamental as water. So similar themes, I love that people are experts on their localities, but you do see similar trends and themes. I do think that each region, each locality, whether it's as small as a neighborhood or as big as a city or a metro Detroit area, should focus on like what is our culture, right? Like what is the culture, those of us who are here year round, what is our culture for organizing? How are we creating communities of care around one another? But we do have more similarities than differences. At the same time, some of the things I hear from especially red states like in Nashville, South Dakota, for example, with the anti-Sharia legislation that's kind of launched in some of these places as testing grounds, I have noticed kind of the erasure of the diversity that does exist in those spaces and the resistance that's there pushing back against that. So I also really want to emphasize the fact that we do, like, alhamdulillah, have Muslims everywhere, right? Like I visited a mosque in Twin Falls, and that mosque, it was being built, like when I went, there were these young teenagers who were working on installing windows, and because it's a primarily refugee kind of community, they'd been paying contractors in installments, right? And so when you come, it's like some of the walls are done and some of the roof, but there's a community there, and that's something that often gets erased in this kind of larger narrative.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum. My question is for all three of you, but before I give you the question, I just had one small comment for Azza. I think you said, when you said that in order to combat white supremacy or dismantle white supremacy, we have to take an anti-capitalist standpoint. I think you meant anti-predatory capitalism, capitalist standpoint, not anti-capitalist in and of itself, but anti-predatory capitalism, I think is predatory capitalism is the actual problem. That was just my comment for you, and you can talk about that later. But my question for all three of you is, if you could just tell us, what kind of strategies can we undertake for effective canvassing, particularly this election coming up? So if you could just sort of touch upon that briefly. Thank you.
So I will, just to address your comment, actually I very intentionally stated anti-capitalist politic, not anti-predatory capitalist politic. And for context, in my full-time capacity, I'm a researcher at the Center for American Progress's Poverty to Prosperity program. And so I'm quite familiar with what those distinctions that I think you're getting at are. I think that if you look at the historical record of how the capitalist structures were created, it is really clear that they were built foundationally to be tied to white supremacy. And I don't want to digress and go off into a conversation that I think is outside the scope of what we're discussing here. But I do want to recommend one reading that I think you might find really interesting that addresses this quite well. And that's the work of Ibram Kendi, who wrote extensively about this history, and it is tied to the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, and how white supremacy and capitalism are inextricably linked, and not only that, but codependent upon one another. And his work is called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas. And he's local, he's at American University, and he's often speaking, so you're welcome to also go to his events. He's a wonderful speaker. But like I said, outside the scope of what we're talking about here, to address your question very briefly, because I want to give my co-panelists an opportunity to as well, I want to share an anecdote from one of my travels when I was lucky enough to be in Birmingham, Alabama with some amazing organizers locally. One of the things that they did, and I credit these organizers, honestly, they are the reason why we don't have an unrepentant pedophile representing the state of Alabama in the US Congress. They organized so effectively. And one of the things that they did was not just like going door to door and knocking and being like, how can we figure out how to keep Roy Moore out of Congress? they were going door to door, but they were also holding meetings to figure out how are we going to address the systematic ways they are attempting to disenfranchise our community to make this a totally non-democratic process. How do we subvert that so that we can make sure that we have the representative we want? And one of the things that they did was they got together and they found creative ways to fundraise so that on election day, they had teams of hundreds of people with cars, including accessible vans, and they were driving out as far as 2 hours away. And everyone who did that to go and pick up groups and drive them to the polls was compensated. They were all given $10 to $12 an hour so that they were able to take that day off, go and take people to the polls and not lose their income and not be adversely impacted. And that is so revolutionary. And I really wanted to amplify that anecdote because I think it speaks to the spirit of what we can do to find creative solutions to address the systematized ways in which they attempt to disenfranchise our communities.
No, that's really great. That's perfect. And I think one thing that I would really recommend, and it's for canvassing, but really just a more kind of broad approach to this idea about getting to know each other, but to approach it from a place of curiosity, because we often, as Imam Omar mentioned, it comes from a very transactional place. We're like, okay, I'm knocking on your door because I need you to do something for me. And instead of coming from this place of curiosity, where you are also not coming in with preconceived notions as to who this person is or what they must stand for, what they must already know about you, but to really approach it as a goal in and of itself to be having that conversation. Because I think with election season, one thing that often happens is that we focus so much on the single campaign or the single candidate and making sure that that is the right person for the community, which is very important. But we also should be thinking about longer term strategy to make sure that no matter who is in that office, we as a community are powerful enough to hold them accountable to us, right? So that focus means that we are not just canvassing because we need a vote and we need that turnout. It's about, hey, what is the level of curiosity? What are your needs? Where can we work together? Who are you as a person? That we can have this locality that is coming together, not just around elections, but longer term. So I feel like that's very important. And I think I really want to emphasize the accessibility of this work. You know, not everybody can afford to take the time to go canvassing. So are you paying people? Are we also then investing in other forms of, you know, being able to keep this process open and have fair and open elections for everybody in the space, whether that is providing rides or other methods to really get out the vote and do some of that work.
So I'm just going to cover what I think hasn't been addressed yet, because most of it has been addressed very eloquently. I'm in Texas, where Beto O'Rourke is running against Ted Cruz, and you know, we absolutely cannot wait to get Ted Cruz out of Congress, inshallah, God will. But I think that in the emphasis, for example, here in Texas on that race, there are a lot of other races like Attorney General and state representative offices, very important races that are overshadowed at times. And this sort of speaks to the presidential election versus the midterm engagement. And I think that even within the midterms, sometimes have a race that just dominates all the other races, and people don't do their due diligence, not just in learning about the other candidates, but at the same time engaging the other candidates that are running for other offices that are maybe as important as the offices that are dominating the spotlight. So I think that that's the first thing that I'd mention is you know, don't let one race dominate all, and one election, one candidacy be the entire focus of work. We have to engage all of those candidates. Second level, I think, is that as Muslims, we have to be very careful not to accept candidates that will be good on our issues, but at the same time marginalize other communities. So I've seen this at many prominent functions where there will be a certain, and I'm not saying we should be completely partisan, but there will be a certain Republican candidate that would show up and that would say great things about the Muslim community, but that would still be dedicated to the same structures that we're mentioning here, the structures and be at the forefront of marginalizing other communities, but be willing to engage in the photo op with the Muslim community only behind closed doors, only for our consumption of the Muslim community, just to get those extra votes, that padding votes, and then completely disappear. And I've seen Muslims far too readily accept those types of politicians coming to our functions and coming to our events and engaging us in that fashion. So if we're really going to think about politics in a principled fashion now, then the candidates that we're willing to engage, entertain, and build relationships with can't just be good on our issues. They've got to demonstrate an overall track record that's consistent and that speaks to our principles. And the last thing here, it was mentioned, but I do want to amplify this, is the way that we completely disappear once a candidate is actually elected. We have to secure commitment before a candidate takes office. If you're going to get the support of our community, these are the issues we need firm commitment from you on. And we're going to be in your face at these regularly scheduled meetings after you are elected to make sure that you're holding true to those commitments. And do not take our votes for your re-election for granted, because if you don't live up to those commitments going forward, then you're not just going to have it in your pocket. I've seen that happen way too many times, right? Where a candidate says all the right things to get the Muslim community's votes the first time around, comes to the masjid, comes to our functions, secures those votes, and then when re-election comes along, the default is that we're going to vote for that candidate again, as opposed to saying, well, look, you really fell short on a lot of the promises that you made the last time around, so what are you going to do differently this time? So at the end of the day, it speaks to how we engage power, and that's been an underlying theme, but I don't want to go off on a tangent either, but how we engage power in our communities. And in our insecurity, we often forget that elected officials work for us, and if they don't do a good job, we fire them. So we have to start engaging with that type of an, as other communities have been very willing to do and very effective at doing.
Thank you, Imam Omar. So just to follow up on that question, especially since we are heading into the midterms, the midterms are a little over 2 weeks away. I mean, I consider this election to be really one of the most important elections in our lifetime. So, you all spoke to the importance of relationship building, the importance of, when we're talking about getting involved in elections, whether it's canvassing, volunteering, making it much more than just, as Namira mentioned, a transactional process, but something where you're building these relationships with these candidates, with these elected officials, making sure that they're not only just fighting for our issues, for our community, but they're really going to be fighting for our values, right? Making sure that they're standing up and fighting for the rights and liberties of every member of all of our communities. So I guess, so two questions. So one, with less than 3 weeks left, what is one thing that you would recommend to folks within our community to be doing to ensure that we elect the right people for our communities that are going to really be fighting for our values? And then second question, and we see this everywhere really, where when we're talking about the general election, there's two distinct candidates. One is just awful and is in terms of every issue we care about, they're pretty much on the wrong side, right? But then the other candidate is okay, is not bad. We agree with them on some issues, not on others. So what, in that sense, how would you recommend our community to, one, to try to push that candidate to be stronger on issues we care about? And I think it was mentioned that, if this person, for example, is elected, who we're voting for, is better on our issues, the need to hold them accountable. but really concrete ways that you would like to see folks within our community involved in that process.
Yeah, so I think it's a really, really great questions. And I think one thing that I often emphasize, especially as a lawyer, I encounter a lot of different kind of viewpoints toward voting. I feel like the era where Muslims are like, oh, is it haram to vote? I feel like that has slightly subsided from when I was growing up. But I think we are still in a place where there is this discussion about voting. I do want to acknowledge that, obviously we have so many people who are disenfranchised from voting altogether, and I'm not going to hold them to the standard of like, this is like on you, right? Instead of all the people who are so apathetic that are not even considering voting, but the person who really cares about the issues and is maybe like for a moral reason abstaining, I'm not going to put this on them to be like, go vote. But I will say voting is a starting point. That's the way I always look at it, that it is just like the bare minimum that we should be doing to engage with our elected officials, because it's you start there, vote at least the person who is more favorable, because usually there's one person who is at least more favorable and gives you at least a little bit more reception, and an audience to what you're wanting from them. At least vote that person in. That's the starting point. From there are different kinds of methods that we can use, and right now with the influence of money in elections and the political system, things are difficult. It's not as easy as necessarily showing up, but showing up to engage with the elected officials, making noise around, and I often talk about using both the carrots and the sticks, right? So incentivizing them actually working well with you, that's important too, but also really being prepared to organize and escalate the situation if they're not listening to you. Sometimes when situations have come up, I remember I was talking to somebody and they were like, there was kind of murmurs of like a boycott or like various actions that people were looking to take. And I was like, yeah, I heard about that too, but I decided to come to you first before even going that route, because we could go that route. But let's try and work it out first, but you should be very well aware that there are further steps to escalate and to shut this down if needed. But we're gonna go along this path. We're gonna start somewhere and then keep going. But that really involves making sure that the community has built enough power to be able to escalate it when needed. And so I think the importance of really building community and knowing faces and having those phone numbers and being able to gather on a regular basis to then discuss what the next steps are, because we often feel that there's nothing to be done, there's a lot of apathy. But especially as Muslims too, like we're rewarded for our intentions. So even if it isn't necessarily a win, it's still a win. We need to be always like reconsidering what the goals and the framing around certain things are. So the work in and of itself to try and hold elected officials accountable, to be meeting with them, to be writing op-eds, to be petitioning, to be trying to boycott, to stage sit-ins, all these different things to hold them accountable, there's value in just doing it by itself.
So I just want to add one brief thing, because I think Namira covered that really well. Political education is so primary in our communities. I think there's often, and with good reason, confusion about certain policies, certain proposals. For example, right now I've been doing a lot of work around the public charge regulatory change proposal, and it is really complicated. That rule change is like a 450-page document, and we need to be really doing the work of ensuring that people have a good foundational understanding of what's at stake. And in order for us to do that effectively, we have to do it accessibly. So that means not only using language that is plain language, but also being mindful of the fact that some community members might need that information accessible to them in other languages. Have we mobilized to have that provided to them? Have we found ways to engage people with learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, people who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, deaf? Are all of those community members able to access the resources that we disseminate so that they can make informed choices when they go to the polls? That is like a really key component, and we really can't afford to wait until the very last moment when the election cycle is ramping up or almost over, and then be like, okay, these are all of the issues that are that are happening right now, that are being discussed, and this is where you should stand on them. This needs to be a sustained effort that is happening constantly, so that we are, as a community, we're informed and no one is really being left out. And also, sorry to have to do this, but just to clarify that I am not here speaking in my capacity representing the Center for American Progress, especially since we just got super electoral in this last question. But I did want to share that piece too. Thanks.
I would say that at this point we focus on turnout. I think it's too late to do any deep education on the candidates at this point. If people weren't interested in being educated about the candidates before these last couple of weeks, then I don't know that we'll really have an effective way of educating them in these last couple of weeks. I think right now it's just the urgency of civic engagement, and accept some of the conclusions of those who have been doing that the last few months or the last couple of years on these particular candidates and issues. Just yesterday, Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and ISPU, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, we've been working on a joint project called Khutbah Toolkits, where we have data-informed. So ISPU sort of brings forth data on the Muslim community. Yaqeen Institute, which is my institute, gives religious languaging, and then we actually produce khutbah talking points, a sample khutbah for people to actually take to their mosques, take and to push people towards. And our khutbah toolkit that went out yesterday was the urgency of civic engagement. And one of the things that resonates very deeply with Muslims, I think, is the power of the story. And that's deeply rooted in our tradition. And so here's a story for you all. In Irving, Texas, we were targeted by the mayor with anti-Sharia legislation. Mayor Beth Van Dyne, who now predictably went on to work for the Trump administration. All 5 city council members who voted in favor of that resolution targeted the Muslim community for cheap political points. We were able to effectively vote out each and every one of them. But the 5th candidate came down to a very interesting moment where it came down to one provisional ballot. And this is something that you just can't make up. Had that provisional ballot not been there, the city of Irving would have had to have a $50,000 runoff. That provisional ballot was cast by a 19-year-old Muslim with disabilities who had to come in a wheelchair to cast that ballot to vote that person out and save the city of Irving from a runoff. I think that it's important to impress upon each and every single Muslim that this is your obligation, that you need to get out there, that the time now is one of action. We're past research. Get to the polls now. So we need to focus on turnout. I think long-term in terms of engaging candidates, I'll share from my own personal experience as well on this, and I sort of mentioned the Cruz and Beto race here, that a lot of times as a community that has acquiesced, accepted, and tokenized for so long, we have a very difficult time distinguishing between rhetoric and policy. For example, the lesser of the two evils thing is just not working anymore. It's not working for the general American public anymore. Just a candidate to just put themselves forward as, I'm not as bad as the other guy, or, that's just not going to work anymore. And I think with the Muslim community, we've gone beyond the jurisprudence of that to arguing from an Islamic ethical perspective that the lesser of the two evils is part of our tradition. But this doesn't work for the public anymore, and it doesn't work for our community. So focusing on policy as opposed to rhetoric. An example of that would be the polarizing issue of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction. Now, that cause is very important to me. However, I'm not going to expect for a candidate to promote BDS. I'm not going to expect the candidate to be perfect on Palestine. Unfortunately, that's where you see the ethical candidate buckle. And suddenly start to read from a script, whereas they've been doing so well without a script on so many other things. So a candidate might be wishy-washy on Israel-Palestine. They might, sprout out the typical points on Israel being a vibrant democracy and being our greatest ally in the Middle East. And they might even say that the BDS movement contains elements of anti-Semitism and is a problematic movement. But at the end of the day, I sit that hand down. Are you going to protect my right to boycott? Are you going to protect my right to BDS? Are you going to protect our institutions when they endorse and sign on to the BDS movement? And religious groups like the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church before they have done, are you going to protect that right to boycott? If you are not, you will not get my vote. So you might be wishy-washy on the discussion, and you might even say that you're personally opposed to BDS, and you'd still get my vote. But I cannot endorse a platform that would criminalize BDS, for example. So I think that we have to sort between policy and that takes research and engagement, which quite frankly, I think going into these last couple of weeks, we don't really have time for now. We have to impress upon our community voter turnout at this point and trust that they're going to make a decision.
Thank you so much, Imam Omar. And with that, making another plug, please vote on November 6th. So we're unfortunately out of time. I wanted to just thank again Namira, Azza, and Imam Omar for a very insightful and productive conversation. Thank you to all of you for joining us.